This is a video on post-Keynesian views. Post-Keynesian views often include critiques of Keynes, some of which we've already seen in the previous video. This week we'll focus on some critiques of Keynes, one of which from Friedman, holding that capitalism is the last stage of economic development, and a couple out of Schumpeter and Abba Lerner, holding that capitalism is not the last stage of economic development. Also, at the beginning of Module 4, we began looking at some of our Nobel Prize winning and more modern theories. We'll take a look at a little bit more of the Chicago School and what we would call freshwater macroeconomic theory. So starting with Milton Friedman, Friedman was generally critical of Keynes' approach because he felt that spending as a recessionary aggregate demand boost would ultimately give government a blank checkbook. And so Friedman often points to the development of large, expensive government buildings, administrative salaries, and so on, asking the question in general, will government spending actually be helpful if it is not spent productively? And so Friedman was worried that this Keynesian approach would make it so economically local, state, federal governments could justify these sorts of spending programs as saying, well, they'll help us get us out of recession. You can kind of compare that to Hayek's view when we took a look at that a few slides ago in The Road to Serfdom, on whether capitalism or this sort of government intervention could be managed in such a way to supplement private investment. In other words, boost aggregate demand when aggregate demand needed boosting, but not otherwise. So there's these concerns about the Keynesian approach, one of which out of Friedman. We also get kind of a fourth theory on the causes of the Great Depression out of Friedman, which is one that I'll review a little bit more in our study guide video. But ultimately, Friedman argued that the Federal Reserve had a very particular job, and the job of the Federal Reserve is to provide short-term loans to local banks in case of bank runs. So banks are not required to hold to the gold standard anymore at this time, and that means that suppose that more people showed up at the bank asking for withdrawals than the reserves held in the bank, that bank would need a short-term loan from the Federal Reserve branch in order to meet those withdrawal requests. So Friedman argued that what happened was that in 1929, there was one bank in particular called the Bank of the United States of America. The Federal Reserve let this bank fail, and after the Federal Reserve let the Bank of the United States of America fail, it triggered a run of a whole wave of bank runs across the United States. People saw one bank failing, they were worried that they weren't going to be able to withdraw their money from their accounts. They all went over to their local banks and asked for their money back. So bank runs we see in Friedman as sort of this social phenomenon based on individual preference. Everybody feels like it's better to go to the bank and try to get what they can out of there rather than trusting the system. We also see Friedman as sort of a segue feature between some of the early Austrians that we have and kind of our later or middle Chicago school. So some themes out of Friedman's writing you see here about the money supply. And that's going to be kind of similar to the Austrians, right? The increases in money supply increase production in the short run, but not in the long run. In the long run, we're worried about this problem of inflation. So that's kind of distinctively Austrian. And then we also see this writing on the role of freedom. Economies which are freer tend to perform better economically. Freedom is in itself a desirable end. And so you might sort of associate those with kind of the modern Chicago school libertarianism. So Friedman kind of associated with both of those groups, one in some degree stemming from the other. Again, we'll look a little bit more about later Chicago monetarism at the beginning of Module 4. Right, so in class at this point, I sort of drew a continuum of the board, and we've now covered sort of our free market schools of thought, holding that capitalism is the final stage of economic progression. We started with the Austrians. The Austrians are generally laissez-faire, free market, non-intervention. And so we talked a little bit about why that was. Business cycles and government altering price signals could lead to inefficiencies. And then we looked at the institutionalists, and then maybe Milton Friedman would kind of belong there with the institutionalists in what we might call limited intervention. In Friedman, the central bank did have a particular job, but just failed to do it. And then we'll see later on in our macroeconomics, rational expectations, a sort of limited intervention type approach. We also had Keynes, and remember, Keynes doesn't say that the government should intervene in every market, but instead, Samuelson, talking about the Keynesian theory, says that it's the role of government to make markets more efficient. So market failures happen. When the government can identify market failures, it should alter aggregate demand via government spending. Right, so at the beginning of the class, I told you about theories which generally hold that capitalism is not the last stage of economic development. The previous schools of thought that we talked about hold that they are, that capitalism is the last stage of development. I've also said that it's not going to be command communism that we talk about as being potentially a post-capitalist stage of development either. So what is there in terms of, I guess, in general, socialism and as a difference from command communism? So in other words, if it's true that capitalism is not the last stage of economic development, then why and where are we headed? One author is Schumpeter, who, like Marx, believed that capitalism was the most efficient system of economic governance, but would ultimately be crushed under the weight of its own profit-oriented pressures. We have this idea of creative destruction, which is the process by which new and efficient industries replace older and inefficient production methods. We talked a little bit in class about examples of creative destruction. There's sort of the classical examples of personal computers replacing typewriters, or maybe cell phones replacing landlines. There's other examples that you can think of there. But in Schumpeter, mankind is defined by this sort of entrepreneurial spirit to make improvements and get things done. And the market acts as this mechanism which drives profit. And companies want to innovate in order to improve their profits, so we get this discontinuous innovation over time that keeps happening. So we scholars often talk about Schumpeter as being two Schumpeters, or being of two minds, in terms of what would happen once markets started monopolizing. Much like Marx, he believed that and saw in the real world that certain markets tended to monopolize, corporations would become very powerful. So in Schumpeter's early work, he noted that we were moving towards this, what he called trustified capitalism, with a handful of powerful corporations controlling most production decisions. And Schumpeter feared that in this world, the entrepreneurial spirit of innovation and making improvements and getting things done would ultimately be crushed by the corporate status quo. So at some point, corporations, he felt, switch over from trying to innovate and improve their product to now they're established in the market and they're trying to maintain their market position. In his later writings, Schumpeter becomes a little bit more favorable towards corporatism, admitting that the entrepreneur spirit doesn't necessarily have to be an individual. It could be a feature of corporations, or corporations could perhaps be more efficient at innovation and improvements. We also see a couple other authors, similarly, Alfred Marshall, who we talked a little bit about already, and then Galbraith, who I posted an optional video about we didn't quite have time for in class. But these series are generally saying that innovation may become easier rather than harder as companies become more profitable. In Marshall, these profitable companies lead to combined knowledge, skill, mastery. You might hear about knowledge spillovers in economics, which lead to innovation. And in Galbraith, technological improvements require kind of this long-term planning. Galbraith says that the easiest and most useful inventions have already been invented. Inventing more stuff takes time. So we have this sort of debate in the literature about whether corporations are or are not going to crush this spirit of innovation. And once the world becomes corporatized, do we get less or more inventions and innovations and product improvements? Ultimately, Schumpeter believes that capitalism cannot survive. So in capitalism, socialism, and democracy, says, can capitalism survive? No. But if a doctor predicts his patient will die presently, that does not mean he desires it. So why can't capitalism survive? Ultimately, even if larger firms are able to innovate, uh, Schumpeter feared that we would get towards this Marxian world of exploitation and alienation as we move towards monopoly. So Schumpeter defines socialism as that organization of society in which the means of production are controlled and the decision on how and what to produce and on who is to get it is made by public authority instead of privately owned and privately managed firms. Already, you see that we're getting kind of towards a critique of these theories, which is, who is this public authority and how is it decided? In Schumpeter, democracy is going to be integral to this understanding. So here we're working towards, I guess, a definition of what you might call democratic socialism or socialism by voting. So in Schumpeter, we have to have this public authority which oversees some key production decisions and enforces the will of the voting worker. If we don't do that, then the alternative again is just this corporate owned monopoly. We're going to get very powerful companies who eventually own everything. And then there's a little bit perhaps less innovation and focus more on maintenance of the status quo. Also worried about exploitation, alienation, driving down worker wages, and so on that occurs in Marx. So Schumpeter believes that we can avoid that Marxian outcome basically by using socialism to control and regulate the markets to the voters' will. Not necessarily that he wants strong government or government control, but rather the role of the government is to enforce the will of the voting worker. All right, we see another theory on socialism out of Abel Lerner, who advocates for what he calls a social dividend. And in his social dividend, he notes that there are a number of industries that are prone to kind of natural monopolies or these goods which are kind of required for living, water, electricity, things like that. And Lerner argues that these industries should be centralized. And then instead of centralizing and then having the government control all of the decisions, which would essentially be a kind of form of command communism, we have the workers influenced by being equal shareholders in the company, or basically all of any profits from the centralized industries are redistributed to the workers or to the public. Public can vote on how these companies are operated, how the profits will be distributed or reinvested. And so ultimately, right, yeah, so kind of getting into critiques then of socialism and theories that capitalism is not the final stage of economic development. One, which industries do we centralize? So in a theory of pure socialism, all industries would be centralized, and then in Lerner, right, we all get these profits back from these industries, which we can make decisions with. And then again, we're sort of bordering on this command economy because then you just have this centralized government controlling all industries. In theoretically, the difference is that between socialism and communism is that in socialism, the central authority is worker owned and operated and democratically enforces using voting interest. Um, you can look out into the real world. Yugoslavia, the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, tried something similar and didn't do so well. We also see some forms of democratic socialism which do seem to be working better in the Scandinavian countries, Iceland, and places like that. So, there's this question of which industries to centralize, how do you do it? Anytime you're going from non-centralization to centralization, does that mean taking means of production out of someone's hands and putting in the government? There can be some friction there. So that all is kind of a concern about socialism as a theory. We have these concerns about tendency for socialism to degenerate into authoritarianism. So anytime you're placing these resources and control authority into the central government, right, it might be reasonable in theory, but in practice, we've seen historically some cases where it goes awry and we get into corruption and authoritarian rule. Let's see. So in a mixed market economy, only certain industries, maybe those crucial to survival or exhibiting clear market failures, are placed under democratic regulation. And so ultimately, again, there's this sort of spectrum of the amount of government intervention with, our first few theories generally somewhat non-intervention. Keynes says we have this targeted intervention, and then in these mixed market economies, this target intervention might include some form of socialism or centralization of some sorts of resources like drinking water or things like that. There's also concerns, finally, about the trade-off between efficiency and equity. Economists generally view markets as the most efficient means of um, regulating goods and services. And so anytime that you have government intervention, thinking back to your 202 class, producer surplus or consumer surplus might be reduced. And so there's this question of how much might we be willing to reduce producer or consumer surplus in order to improve equity or equality. So that's always a general argument as well. All right, finally, just sort of these summaries of the schools of thought. You can mostly read them on your own, but again, sort of just thinking of it as a spectrum or timeline from the Austrians, who are more laissez-faire, non-intervention, to these other forms of intervention, Keynesian kind of a targeted intervention idea. And then we have, pure socialism would be a widespread intervention, mixed markets, a little bit more Keynesian. All right, in the next video, I will do a review for our exam.